Happy Tuesday. I'm Donna Riccobono. I'm Project Director of the Maryland and DC Deafblind Project. Here with me is my team, Jen Willis, Rebecca Halmer, Sherry Dowling, Jennifer Stepanek, and today we have one of our favorite presenters talking about one of our favorite topics. So we're excited to have him here with us again, back by popular demand. So Chris Russell, I had a list of things that wonderful things I wanted to say about you. Okay, here they are. I found them because I'm not available for learning, so I had to find my list. Chris Russell wears many hats, but one of them is he is the project coordinator of New York Deafblind Collaborative, which is the New York Deafblind Project. He also is a teacher at Hunter College, and he wears many hats, works with AER, president of that chapter. So Chris is around. He's a certified teacher of the visually impaired, and we are honored and blessed to have him as part of our Deafblind network. And he has been very busy. He has authored a few things. One of them has been co-authored with our own Jennifer Willis on CVI and AAC that we've been presenting on quite often also throughout this year. So before Chris Russell starts talking and introduces himself a little bit more, I just want to make sure that everyone has their camera off and their sound muted so we can all hear Chris Russell. Today's webinar is from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Please feel free to ask any questions, just put it in the chat box. And Chris Russell, are you okay? Do you want us to stop you? We'll monitor the chat box. Okay. So go ahead, and it's ongoing. Just if you have a question as Chris is talking, please put it into the chat box and then we will read it to him. And also any other questions or concerns, please put it in the chat box as well. We will monitor that. At the end of the presentation, there will be an evaluation. Please complete it. We love to hear feedback from all of you so we know what it is you're looking for, what other types of training, and we can put it together. So we just need to have that information from you. So the evaluations are important to us. Okay, Chris Russell, are you ready? Today's topic, supporting availability for learning for students with cortical visual impairment and significant cognitive disabilities. Thanks for being here, Chris.
This is Chris. Thank you so much, Donna, for the lovely introduction. And thanks to Donna and the whole team for having me again back with you. Yes, I will. Let me just share my screen and get started. Let's see. Okay, give me 1 second. I am opening up my chat box on the side, actually. So if you have any questions, comments, aha moments, or especially if there are any tangents that you'd like me to take you on over the next hour and a half, please do type those into the chat box and I will run with your tangents and answer your questions as they go. And of course, if I miss anything, feel free to chime in and interrupt me. So I want to talk just a little bit about sort of the idea behind this before launching into it. I always have way more content to cover than we have time in which to cover it. So we'll get through as much as possible. Might kind of jump around a little bit, but I did include everything in a PowerPoint slides, which I'm more than happy to share with anybody who would like a copy of them. You're also welcome to reach out to me. There's my email address below as well. So first I want to just say, we're not going to have time to do like a foundational CVI overview. So I'm sort of half assuming that everyone in the room has at least some background on CVI, and based on the amount of work that you all do on CVI in Maryland, I know there's folks from outside of Maryland too, but based on the amount of work that you all do on CVI, I'm guessing that you probably have that foundation. So we'll cover a few of those foundational pieces. If there are things that I refer to that seem like a little bit specific to CVI that we don't have time to cover, feel free to ask for clarification in the chat box and I can kind of quickly summarize what that's about. What I've found is that this is sort of a topic, this idea of availability for learning, and a term that gets sort of thrown around loosely as if it's a vague term that sort of generally means readiness or attending, availability in terms of the student is looking or listening, which of course becomes problematic when you have students that don't exhibit traditional or conventional looking and listening behaviors. Students with CVI, students who are deafblind, who maybe have CVI and hearing loss or deafblind from other ocular conditions, as well as just students who struggle to maintain equilibrium, internal as well as sensory and behavioral equilibrium throughout the day. And we'll come back to that word equilibrium in terms of what that means on a biophysical level as well as on an environmental level for a lot of our students, and that's not just the students with CVI. So while I want to take this through the lens of cortical visual impairment and talk about what's unique for kids with CVI, I want to share with you some resources and ideas that I think may be appropriate to many of your students, and really maybe just to people in general, and to students in general. Some of the more technical stuff is involved in making this term, which is used quite vaguely, availability for learning, much more specific and measurable. And if it can be specific and measurable, then we can assess it, and we can, which we love to do, right, as educators, and we can come up with quality interventions that are deliberate and not just sort of informal. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. I said I'm not going to do a foundational overview of CVI, but I want to just refresh and remind you about the specific CVI characteristics, which are going to help us think about, well, what does this mean in terms of promoting availability? What do the impact of the unique behavioral characteristics have on availability for learning, and how can adaptations to these characteristics influence the student to be more available? Color preferences, need for or attraction to movement. And of course, these things look different as the student advances along the range of visual functioning, the CVI range, but it's still the same characteristic. Difficulty with visual latency, okay, a visual processing delay. Visual field preferences, and I want to reinforce and emphasize that these are field preferences, not losses. A field loss is a field cut where a student does not have access to information in that field at all. In CVI, it's a preference. It's harder to access information in that field, and information in the other field is maybe more preferred. Lower field tends to develop later, and that doesn't mean that no information is available in the lower field. It means that information in the lower field is more difficult to access, and it's not a preferred field for getting information. Difficulty with visual complexity, and there are 4 types of complexity. The one that we're going to talk about a lot as it relates to availability for learning is multisensory complexity, sensory complexity. Complexity of targets. One target, say the little yellow duck in the middle, is much less complex than this little wind-up toy on the lower left side. Complexity of the array, which also definitely has an impact on a student's attending and ability to visually show availability for learning. Okay, but that's not the same thing as overall internal equilibrium and biophysical impact. Where something in a complex array, whether it's 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional, may be harder to access visually, as opposed to pulling that item out and putting against a less complex background where it pops out. Okay. Need for or attraction to light, which is not just light gazing, but also further along the range, that light enhances attending and visual fixation. And backlighting or illumination makes it easier to focus on materials. Okay. And these are generalizations, right? We need to understand how the characteristics impact each individual student. So this is just obviously a refresher on the foundational stuff, but I want this in your mind as we start to think about availability. Difficulty with distance viewing, which is really the same thing as difficulty with complexity of the array. And that's because, as in this picture on the lower left side of the preschool classroom shelf with all the busy toys, if your face is only 2 inches away from one of those toys, you don't have a very complex array and you can probably see that object in front of you. But when you get 10 feet back, now we have this very complex array. Okay, so the further you are from something, the more other items are in the array, including background patterns and, in a classroom, people moving around and whatnot. Atypical visual reflexes, that's just a gauge for sort of understanding the current level of visual functioning. It doesn't have an impact on visual functioning per se. It's a way of looking at where a student is. Difficulty with visual novelty, and we're gonna, of course, note that novel or unfamiliar objects or targets, as well as environments, are more difficult than familiar objects, targets, and environments, as well as people. So that's going to have an impact on availability for learning in terms of being in novel and complex environments. Later on, we'll look at considering, say, what a community outing might look like, what going to the grocery store might look like, and how it could be overstimulating, and what could we do about that. Difficulty with visually guided reach. And of course, visually guided reach is the ability to look at, reach for, and tactually explore a target simultaneously. For students who don't have the motor control, the voluntary motor control to initiate a reach, I think it's important that we find creative alternative ways to measure that. I don't think that we should score a student out of 9 characteristics if they cannot initiate reach. I think we can understand the visually guided reach characteristic as actually being the same thing as multisensory complexity. It is the simultaneous ability to visually and tactually attend at the same time. It's crossing those 2 sensory channels. So for a student who can't initiate a reach, can they use a visual behavior to attend or to explore while someone is in physical contact with them, whether it's hand under hand or maybe if the child is sitting on someone's lap or is getting some physical support to do something, or is even in physical proximity with another person. Does that affect their visual skills? So in that way, I do think visually guided reach is very parallel, if not the exact same thing, as multisensory complexity. Okay, and that we will bring up as it relates to availability for learning as well. Okay, so that was just a very quick, 5-minute version of the CVI characteristics, just as a reminder and a refresher so that we can refer to them as we go on. Here is a 2-page fact sheet. It's supposed to be 2 pages. That's the second page of it. There's a 2-page fact sheet that I made up on CVI to give you some go-to ways of explaining things, some shared language to use, definitions, and answers to frequently asked questions and resources. So if you don't have that, if you don't feel like you have that strong foundation in CVI, or if you just want a good handout to use with folks, then feel free to use this. Anything I share with you here, feel free to reach out to me if you can't find a copy of it somewhere. And hi, Brenda. Thanks for your comment. Okay, so availability for learning, of a kind of vague, open-ended term that I think we throw around a lot in education. And we don't think of it as being something specific and measurable. We think of it more as, an informal way of saying the child's ready to learn, right? And what does that actually mean? So how do you know if your child or student is available for learning? How can you tell that the child is alert, especially when we have children with complex healthcare needs and, say seizure disorders, limited voluntary motor control, and so on. A child who may not even, sometimes you may not even know if the child is awake or asleep. How do you know if the child is attending if they're not attending visually? How do you know that they are responsive or responding if they don't respond in conventional ways, in ways that are easily recognizable to people? How do we know that they are processing information? That's hard. And how do we know that they are retaining information? If they can't show us that or tell us that in conventional ways that we, would otherwise look for our students who have expressive communication that is understandable to a greater number of people. Okay. And if you're a special educator in any role, I'm sure that you are familiar with this challenging aspect of our work when you work with students with complex communication needs and complex healthcare needs, as well as multisensory challenges, that we sometimes we don't know if we're doing the right thing because we're waiting months and months and months to see progress, to see, oh, what I've been doing actually makes sense. And what I've been doing has actually been working for this student. And we have to create these routines that we practice over and over and over again. And then suddenly the student shows you in some way that they understand and that they are making a connection. Okay. So that's obviously a challenging part of our work, and we need to think about more clear ways to be able to tell, are we doing the right thing? Are we teaching to a student who is maximally available throughout the day? So let's take a step back and just think about, well, before looking at any of those questions, what is learning? Learning is physical change in the brain. What we see here is a sort of like a screenshot, if you will, of like a micro MRI, an fMRI. And what we're seeing here is all of these neuron synapses connecting in the brain. And that very bright place, that very bright point in the sort of in the middle there, is a place where neuron synapses are interacting and connecting and creating stronger connections. This image is basically a proof that routine-based learning works. Because what we're seeing here is that the channels in the brain, the neuron synapses in the brain that are used frequently are the ones that are brighter and stronger. The more that those signals and messages go through the brain at those connection points, at the synapse point, the stronger the protein sheathing, the myelin sheathing around those synapses gets. Okay, around those pathways gets. So, and those really strong points are points where multiple connections are being made, right? So of course we can't tell by observation if this is happening on a neurological level. We have to be able to tell on a behavioral level. Of course, that's what CVI range assessment is, right? It's looking at places where we're observing actual physical change in the brain, neurological development, and strengthening of pathways by being used. That's why whenever we're working towards making progress in visual processing, we are targeting intervention at the student's current level of visual functioning. We're not going above their current level. We're trying to give them more practice doing the things that they can already do so that those pathways get stronger and stronger because they're being used more and more. Okay. So once you know what a student can do, keep doing it. And then you'll see that the student's getting stronger at doing it. And then you'll see that the student is suddenly doing more things that they weren't doing before. So because we can't, do a live MRI of our students while we're working with them, and not that that would be that helpful anyway, what can we do observationally to understand if our student or our child is learning? There are some ways to think about this on a sort of elementary level, on a beginning level. What are the foundational examples and manifestations of learning? And then these kind of grow into bigger practices too, and bigger things you can observe. One is just habituation, getting used to something that used to make you startle or be distracted or have some other response, reflexive response even, but now you don't notice it. Something that makes you surprised before, but now you don't notice it because you're habituated to it. That means that the brain has made the connection, has experienced that whatever the trigger was, right? Whatever the stimulus was, it's recognizable, it's understandable, and so the response doesn't happen anymore. And I'll share a little story with you, which I'll bring up again in a few different places. And this was a student who I saw in a hospital, in a pediatric hospital setting, and the student had sustained a very significant brain injury, traumatic brain injury, and really had no voluntary motor control, including no ocular motor control. And so the team thought that the student probably had CVI and kind of probably guessed that it was in phase 1, but they didn't really know because they couldn't get any kind of consistent response from the student. And that is because he didn't have any voluntary motor control that they had found at that point. So I kind of came in to try to see if I could figure out some things, CVI wise. And I brought in my, CVI bag of tricks and all of the glow sticks and the pom poms and the slinkies and the light up toys and everything. And I tried everything. And I was almost at the point of saying, I'm really not sure what to do here. And I don't know. I don't know how to assess this student because they're not even having ocular motor responses that I can attribute to reaction. And I was almost at the point of saying I kind of put my hands up, and the nurse who was sitting there actually said, "Oh, but didn't you notice that he really liked that green light up toy, that green glow stick that you showed him?" And I said, "Well, that's interesting. How did you know that he liked that?" Because I had shown him a red glow stick, a blue glow stick, a green slinky, a green pom pom, all the different. So why specifically the green glow stick? And she said, "Oh, because I noticed that his heart rate went up every time you showed him that." Because she was watching the heart rate monitor. And sure enough, when I tried all of those things over and over again, I found absolutely correct, consistently, he was responding to the green glow stick, not the red one, not the blue one, not the green slinky, not the green pom pom, just the green glow stick with an increased heart rate. Now, I don't know if that means that he liked it. It's a pre-intentional response. It may mean that he is frightened. It may mean he's excited. It may mean he is anxious. It may mean he's surprised. It may mean he likes it. It may mean he doesn't like it. What I do know, though, is that it means that he sees it. And I can use that as a starting point for a CVI intervention. And I can know that he's learning one way or another because over time, if I show him that green glow stick consistently, and I don't mean like all day, but if I make that the beginning point of my CVI intervention, what I'm looking for is habituation. What I'm looking for is that over time, that green glow stick won't make him excited or startled or distracted or whatever it is that's making his heart rate go up. And his heart rate won't go up when I show him the green glow stick. But at that point, because I know how kind of CVI works and CVI intervention works, at that point, I'm going to start expecting that he's going to be seeing some other things that he didn't see before. So now maybe the red glow stick will make his heart rate go up. Or now maybe the green pom pom will make his heart rate go up. And we can kind of take it from there. So even that student, who everyone who worked with that student thought, we really don't know what to do with him. We found a starting point, right? And that starting point targeted a combination of a CVI intervention and an availability for learning intervention, which had to do with developing habituation skills. we'll come back to that because I think it's an example that we can take in a couple different directions, especially for kids with really the most profound and complex needs. Another early form of learning is association, and the spoon and pudding example is what it sounds like. When you show the student the spoon, because of association, they expect the pudding, right? Because every time the spoon comes out, it comes along with the pudding. What you're looking for is some sort of shift in state that indicates anticipation, and that can be unique to the student. Okay, it could be heart rate, it could be flushness of tone, it could be breathing pattern, it could actually be orienting and looking, it could be moving a limb a little bit, but whatever it is, it's anticipation. Okay, and involve the family in identifying anticipatory cues and behaviors, because the family knows what those cues are, and the family probably knows exactly what they mean, whereas the educators who don't see the student as often might be going around in their heads, what does this mean, what is the behavior? So ask the family and involve them in that process. Now, once you have habituation, association, and then you're showing that with an anticipatory shift, then you can inject the element of surprise, right? Now you've got your routine and you can sabotage it. You can change things up. You can bring out the spoon and not have it associated with the pudding, have it associated with something totally different. And, you might elicit some anger at this pudding not being there, but that's an opportunity to build communication and other learning. Okay. And I didn't make all this up. I borrowed it from the great Ravi Bleha, and a lot of this stuff is on the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired website. I'm just synthesizing it and bringing it into this context. So that anticipatory shift is also called an orienting reflex, a reflexive alerting to significant things. It's a shift in state, and it looks different from student to student. It is not a defensive startle. It's something that shows that the student is changing arousal states. Might look different for each student. For that little guy in the example I gave you, the heart rate was the one that we could identify. Maybe it's not the only one, but it's the one that we could observe and we could find. And that's great. At least we found one. It might be something physical for another student. It might be visual. It could be another pre-intentional behavior. And again, involve the family. Okay. So when are we not learning? And here's my little cartoon versions of myself. We're not learning when we're stressed, when we're stressed out. There's some inside jokes in there, like looking at OSEP grant papers and stuff. We are not learning when we're stressed out, and we are not learning when we're passed out. And there's some, TVI inside jokes over there with the Foundations of Low Vision textbook. We're not learning on either sides of this spectrum, right? And I think frequently, we would all hopefully recognize that a student is not learning when they're passed out, but how often are we expecting students to be attending and learning and processing information and retaining information when they're stressed, when they're overstimulated? That's not a conducive time for learning on a neurological level. So we have to think about both sides of that spectrum of arousal and recognize that neither extreme side is conducive to learning neurologically. Now, stress, and this is a great article by David Brown, comes out of field of deafblindness and charge syndrome in particular, but I think we could apply this to everyone that we work with and to ourselves too. This great article called Stress, Good Cop versus Bad Cop. And what David Brown talks about is that stress is a protective response, but only if it's limited and within that person's control. Now, if you think back to like your child development and child psychology coursework and remember Vygotsky, right? And I hope I'm not traumatizing anybody, to think back on your grad school or anything. But Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development, right? The zone of proximal development means that the level of challenge is balanced by the level of skills and opportunities. Okay, so if the challenge is too high for the skills and opportunities, we're out of balance. And if the skills and opportunities are higher than the level of challenge, then we're bored, right? So we don't want to overwhelm a student and stress them out to the point that they don't feel like they can do it, and they're gonna, they're gonna freak out. And we also don't want to give a student too low of expectations, because then they're going to get bored and equally they're not going to learn. So stress is actually a protective response if it's at that balance, right? If it's within that zone of proximal development. Stress allows you neurologically, norepinephrine and other stress hormones that we release when we're stressed, actually promote brain development. We need stress in order for our brains to grow. It's about responding to challenges, taking on tasks, learning problem solving skills, and so on. We think of stress as a bad thing, but when we're talking about that word stress in our culture and our society, we usually mean the bad side of it, when stress hormones are active for too long and it feels overwhelming. That's toxic stress. Toxic stress, the stereotype that we have of stress in our society anyway, is that stress looks like hyperactivity, tantrums, freaking out, tearing your hair out, right? But that's not actually toxic stress. Toxic stress is shutdown. Toxic stress is exhaustion. And ultimately, the worst form of toxic stress is learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is the opposite of self-determination. Okay, think about that for a second. Self-determination is the feeling of, even though this is a new challenge in front of me, I've got the skills to take on this challenge. I got this, and I can advocate for myself. Learned helplessness is, I don't know how to face this situation that's in front of me because my experiences in the past have taught me that I can't do it. So I'm just going to shut down and stop trying. That's what we want to prevent at the highest level. Right? Learned helplessness has to do with that loss of the center of control. Okay, and we don't have to go on and on about this, but learned helplessness is categorized by stopping trying and shutting down, not by freaking out and being hyperactive and having tantrums and behaviors. That's not learned helplessness. I'm going to kind of like skip through this a little bit. It's just more about, protective factors against toxic stress. These are all of the good things that we want to be thinking about in general, right? The biggest protective factors against toxic stress have to do with responsive relationships and safe environments, as well as social opportunities and other things that promote feelings of competence. There was a really awesome study in 2013 by Nelson and some colleagues, by Kathy Nelson and some colleagues, measuring cortisol levels before and after intervention of students with multiple disabilities, including some students who are deafblind. And cortisol is a stress hormone that your brain releases when you're stressed, along with adrenaline and norepinephrine. But cortisol is very easy to measure just with a little cotton swab of saliva inside the cheek. So it's a good way to kind of get a gauge on stress. Now, what they assumed is that kids with, what I think we all would assume, is that kids with the most severe behaviors, right, including self-injurious and aggressive, toward others behaviors, would have higher levels of cortisol, stress hormone, than kids who didn't have those behaviors. Okay, and what was really interesting about this is that the study actually found the opposite. The study actually found that students with more severe behaviors had lower levels of cortisol, and that is because behaviors serve as a coping mechanism against stress. Okay, this makes perfect sense. When you're stressed, when you're overwhelmed, when you're angry per se, when you're having a real freak out, what do you want to do? You want to punch a wall or break a plate, or, I don't know what you want to do, scream. Those are release behaviors. Okay? And those behaviors actually serve to reduce your cortisol so that they don't develop into toxic levels of stress. So I'm not suggesting that maladaptive behaviors are a good thing, but they are much better than learned helplessness, which is full on shutdown. So those behaviors are in fact a coping mechanism for stress. So what we want to do if kids have behaviors like that, we want to recognize that something is stressing them out and making them feel this way. And we need to find a way to shape those maladaptive and harmful behaviors into more functional ways of coping with stress and reducing whatever it is that's causing the stress. There was a really great study in asking this question. When is a child ready for an activity and what should we do about that? Which has to do with our way of thinking about availability in a kind of non-specific way, alert versus non-alert. So in this study, they surveyed like 300 teachers and they asked the teachers, do you prefer to teach students who are alert versus not alert? And unsurprisingly, 98% of the teachers said that they like to teach students who were alert versus students who were not alert. So congratulations, 98% of people have common sense and maybe 2% have some issues that we should discuss later. So that's great. We can all assume that we want to teach students who are alert. But what was alarming and interesting about this study is that almost 70% of those teachers reported postponing teaching due to non-alertness. So what does that mean? That means that if we have a student who's not alert, 70% of us are going to say, they're not ready for that right now. Let's come back later. But what if you have a student who's not alert for a large part of the day? What if you have a student who maybe is only alert for a 5-minute window in a 1-hour activity? Are we just going to come back later? And I think the answer to that question is no. How can we promote alertness when a child is not alert, rather than just come back later? And thank you for your comment, Lynn. And nice to see you there too. Really great to see you. Okay. So we can start to think about ways to answer that question. How do we promote learning when a child's not alert? Go back to thinking about multisensory channels, sensory access points. Now, we all have these various sensory channels, our tactual, auditory, olfactory, visual, vestibular, proprioceptive, kinesthetic, even gustatory, taste related, oral motor, which is also kind of like a combination of olfactory, gustatory, and tactual. Okay, different ways of taking in sensory information. And we can all think of different calming and alerting stimuli that impact those sensory channels. So start by just thinking about what calms and alerts you. And if you can, in the chat box, if you drive a car or have ever driven a car before, you've all had that experience where you start to feel drowsy when you're driving, right? And you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to fall asleep while you're driving. So when you start to feel drowsy and you start to feel your kind of head nodding down and your eyes kind of closing, what do you do to wake yourself up? Open the window, turn up the radio. What else do you do? Shout, okay, talk, eat, slow down. So that's good. Sing. There's always someone who says they smack their face. Hey, whatever works for you. Energy drink, maybe drinking coffee, drinking something cold, tap my leg, listen to the radio. This is good, right? A pretty nice array of different things that you do. Pull over, move the car, pull over for a nap. If you really can't do anything to wake yourself up, you pull over. Okay. Call someone. All of the different things that you just described, that you just mentioned, they are all examples of alerting stimulus that fit into different sensory channels. Rolling down the window is an example of a tactual alerting stimulus. The cool air, and it could also be an auditory stimulus too, or even a tactual stimulus, tactile auditory stimulus of just the air, right? If you turn up the radio or you turn on specific music, that's alerting auditory input. If you actually drink like an energy drink or coffee, then you're changing your biophysical structure. You're literally giving yourself a chemical in order to wake yourself up. And there's something that you all probably do before you do anything else, and you don't even think about it because it's so automatic. And Kimberly said it right there. You change your position. It's probably the first thing that you do. You sit up in your seat, you move your body in a way to get you to wake up a little bit. Okay? So you know what to do to alert yourself on multisensory levels, in multisensory channels when you need to. Can your students do any of these things independently? When they're feeling drowsy, can they give themselves light, cool air, turn on a fan or open a window? Can they turn on something loud to wake them up a little bit? Students who have, what you usually deem as sensory seeking behaviors, hand flapping, rocking, consider maybe that they're doing those things to give themselves alerting or calming sensory input in order to be able to attend better. Okay. For students with CVI, they may need to look away while listening so that they don't get overstimulated. Okay. They may do some other things in order to keep them from getting overstimulated. And if you have students who have significant physical challenges and are in, say a Riften chair or other adaptive seating, can they actually even change their positioning, which is probably the first thing that needs to happen to get a student to be more alert or more calm. Also consider that if you have children who have other central nervous system disorders or other neurological processing conditions that kids with specific syndromes, chromosomal disorders might have, maybe neurotypical calming and alerting stimulus might not actually be the same for that student. Maybe something that might be calming for you is alerting for your student, and vice versa. So it's important to get a good understanding of what the student's sensory preferences are, in addition to just what their visual profile is and what their visual functioning is. So you could go back to something like this, sensory channel assessment, which is part of an adapted version of a learning media assessment, typically used for kids who have ocular visual impairments to determine whether or not they are Braille readers or if they're print readers, but totally appropriate to a student with CVI or really to any student, where you're just trying to figure out what are the student's primary and secondary and even any tertiary sensory channels that are used throughout the day. You're just recording behaviors, any behavior that you see, like hanging up the coat on the coat hanger. How did the student do that? They looked away and reached and felt around for it. So write that down, and that is a tactile behavior. Okay. Why is it tactile behavior? Because it's too visually complex at the coat area. So it was too hard for it to be a visual behavior. So is that something we want to adapt, or is that something we want to treat as a tactile skill? Okay, so you write down all the behaviors, and then you just are looking at which ones are used more often throughout the day, which ones are circled more: visual, tactual, auditory, movement, or smell. This adapted sensory channel form is also good because it asks these types of open-ended questions like, what calms the child? You write down some examples and then you circle, well, are those visual inputs, tactile inputs, and so on. What alerts the child, what stresses, what overloads. Now imagine children with CVI, what overloads the child is probably going to be some visual overstimulation, maybe some multisensory overstimulation. Okay, what are their favorite toys and so on. So this is a good way to kind of start that conversation. Also, you could look at the likes and dislikes form that is on the from the Washington Deafblind Project, the Washington Sensory Disability Services. Yes, you can have a copy of anything that I share here. If you can't find that online, you can always email me and I'll send you a copy. But you should be able to find that online. This likes dislike form is really good to get a good preferences profile on a student. I like this form because it covers a lot of different areas, right? It even covers self-stimulation as a preference, right? Not treating it as a maladaptive behavior. It's a way of accessing a preference. So we're looking at this and we're trying to think, well, how does this relate to sensory channels? And then on the other page, it's the dislikes form. No, I have not seen the every move counts assessment. I would love to see that though. Cool. Yeah, definitely. If is it easy to find online, or if not, can you share it with me? Cool. Some other people say that's good too. Yeah, this is basically a sensory profile that you're doing, but you're doing it with in mind of the impact on availability, the impact on alertness, whether that is calming or alerting. So how might all of this stuff be different for kids with CVI? Well, first of all, multisensory complexity has an impact on all of the other characteristics. And I think this is an overarching, overriding characteristic of CVI and has an impact throughout the day, especially has more of an impact even functionally as a student improves in their visual functioning, and even well on into phase 3, maybe even more so. Because as a student improves in their visual functioning with regard to CVI, that means that they're using their vision more throughout the day. And so they're going to be more prone to getting overstimulated and to burning out, right? And to exhibiting those, CVI meltdown behaviors. But it does impact kids in all phases. In phase 1, we've got kids who have a limited use of vision throughout the day. You have to plan targeted times to look. So that means that any vision intervention is going to have reduced multisensory complexity, environmental complexity, increased control of the environment in phase 1 for anything visual related. Anything that is not anything that is not a visual goal or a visual activity, don't expect vision in, because the student's not going to be using their vision when the environment is more complex. In phase 2, we're kind of in that in-between stage, right? Where the student can use their vision throughout the day, but only if the right adaptations are in place and only at targeted points in the routine. Of course, there's a difference between early phase 2 and late phase 2. And that major difference is that kids in early phase 2 are not making eye to object contact. They're not fixating on things. So they're going to need, targeted interventions, things to look at specific points throughout the day, but it's only going to be a brief look. Whereas in later phase 2, they are making eye to object contact, they're visually exploring a bit more, and they're using their vision at an increased amount of time throughout the day. So we're going to adapt more, and we're also going to expect that sensory complexity is going to impact them more. And as I said, in phase 3, the students using their vision for learning all throughout the day, and they're visually curious, they're looking around and exploring. So we're going to see a spike in CVI meltdowns, these sort of like, the student's burnt out and is going to have, a tantrum, whatever that looks like for the individual student. Or they're just going to be overstimulated and burnt out. That means that visually taxing activities that require intensive use of vision, like anything with two-dimensional materials, reading, writing, math, anything that, using a communication display that is highly busy, is going to need to be planned accordingly. Now, I've heard different people refer to, different analogies about this. And I think Matt Tejan talks about like your phone. When your phone's about to die, there's nothing you can do but plug it in. You have to recharge, right? And the battery is going to drain over the day. I like that analogy a lot. The analogy that I like to use that kind of fits the way that I think about it, and what I've observed in a lot of different students, is that it's more like a thermostat. Okay, like a thermostat on your car. And you have to recognize that once it gets into the red area, once it gets into the red zone, because you've been pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, you can't stay in the red zone for very long before you're going to burn out. And once you're burnt out, that's it. End of, could be end of day. Definitely end of activity. So what can you do? You can look at the student throughout the day and kind of have a gauge and think, what I'm doing now is really pushing up towards the red. So now I need to cool back down, right? And it doesn't mean stop completely. A visual break or a sensory break, it doesn't mean, do nothing or like, hide under a blanket. It means no visually taxing activity, okay, until we've got some time to cool down. And I can't give you an amount of time because that is individual to the student. Once you get into that red zone, you've got to cool down, otherwise you will have a burnout. Okay, complexity of the sensory environment involves external factors and internal factors. And we've got to look at both. External factors can be things like lighting, the noise, the temperature in the room, and think about, alerting, calming stimulus. When it's a little too warm in the room, you get drowsy, right? When it's a little too cold in the room, you get kind of like uptight and shivery, and you're probably not going to fall asleep. But it's also equally hard to focus. Positioning and trunk support are huge. Direct interaction and social interactions are sensory overstimulating. They're great, but they also have to be sort of considered as part of that picture. And then there are internal factors that we may or may not have control over. The student's tired, hungry, they're in pain, they're experiencing the side effects of medication like seizure meds. The student has to take seizure meds, and the seizure meds make them pass out for 2 hours. So what does that mean? It means if the student takes the seizure meds at 8 a.m., right before they go to school, they will be passed out from 8:30 to 10:30. And maybe that's not avoidable, or maybe it is. We know that the student has to take the medication, but do they have to take it at that time? Can it be instead administered by a school nurse at the end of the school day? Or can it be administered when they get home so they can take a nap after school? And so on. So if it becomes a problem for availability for learning and, a lot of the school days being wasted, then you do have to go even down to thinking about this biophysical plan. And emotional, right? When you're not feeling well, you're really not available and attending. When a child with CVI is not feeling well emotionally for whatever reason, it may actually show up in their vision. Okay, that's unique. The OHOA, Open Hands, Open Access intervener modules have a lot of really good information about availability for learning for kids who are deafblind. And I borrowed this graphic from them because I think it summarizes these internal and external factors. It kind of expands on that. And it also has this good kind of like, graphic analogy of, a scale. And we're kind of balancing those internal, external factors and figuring out, what promotes a sensory equilibrium. Okay. One of the most common misconceptions I get about kids with CVI is that they have fluctuating vision throughout the day. It's not the child's vision that's fluctuating. Okay, the student's vision is not variable and changing. It's the complexity of the environment, the internal and the external factors that are constantly fluctuating. And I think we talk about this a lot in the CVI world, right? But I think most of the time when we talk about it, we're talking about external factors, okay? The complexity of the array, the complexity of the sensory environment. But I want to think now too about internal factors that are influencing the complexity of the environment. How the student's feeling, the amount of sleep they got the night before, the impact of medication. Those also impact multisensory complexity and environmental complexity. And therefore, they appear to have a fluctuating influence on vision. But again, it's not the vision that's fluctuating. The vision and the visual processing is staying the same. It's all those other factors that are making it harder for the student to use that vision in a meaningful way. Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you can watch an entire webinar on this and you can go and read the book. But I just want to point to this tool, this sensory balance approach to learning media planning, developed by Dr. Roman and Matt Tejan, which is a great way of figuring out which sensory channels should you use in which activities. And it's like an alternative almost to a learning media assessment for student with CVI. It's looking at the combination of all those different channels and identifying what are the most visually taxing activities in that student's day and what adaptations or accommodations are needed to support them in the visually taxing activities, as well as in the non-visually taxing activities. This is to remind you that multisensory overstimulation is an observable thing. You can observe that kids are overstimulated if you're paying attention. And, it's usually pretty obvious. The student's making a face like the one that this cat is making in my favorite YouTube cat video of all time. If you want to watch that, you just look in YouTube for cat can't handle flower on head. Usually we can tell that a student is stressed, overstimulated, about to have a meltdown, if we're paying attention. Okay, also, Matt Tejan's What's the Complexity Framework deals with this issue as well. A balanced activity and a balanced schedule, okay? And he's got tons of good information about this. There's a great explanation of all of this on the Pediatric Cortical Visual Impairment Society website, pcvis.vision. And including these graphics are on the PCVIS website. And it's looking at that balance between what level of complexity in the environment is happening and can the student handle, right? This kind of minimal, moderate, high, extreme. And again, it's almost like this thermostat analogy, versus how complex is the task. And he breaks these down into many different ways of looking at the complexity of task related to the CVI characteristics specifically. There's a really great way to start to kind of tease out what is too much for my student. Okay, so could we have like a sensory balance thermostat? I mean, that's kind of what what's the complexity framework is, but could you actually develop one like a graphic tool that a student could use to keep track of, or at least that the team could use with the student to keep track of where that student is at? Could you literally have like a little dial, on the student's desk that you could throughout the day, you could kind of, everybody could be aware of how far towards the red are we right now? This is one of those kind of like, I forget what to call it. It's like the feelings chart, in social emotional learning curriculum that is being used a lot now, in gen ed settings. And, it's zones of regulation. Thank you, Linda. Students are supposed to use this with the support of their teachers to kind of identify where they're at in their feelings, right? Could you do the same kind of thing for where a student with CVI is at in terms of their level of overstimulation? Okay, maybe something simple like this for a student in phase 3 who can identify, I'm exhausted versus I'm tired, I'm ready to go, I'm getting overstimulated, and now I am overstimulated in the red, right? And, just this is just an idea to throw out there. Might this be useful for some of you in terms of building some of those expressive skills, as well as those sort of self-determination skills that are important for a student with any student? But could you adapt that to a student with CVI? So we're not just talking about feelings, we're talking about starting to identify levels of stimulation or readiness. I could get way deeper into this, but auditory support and hearing assistive technology, even for students who don't have hearing loss or specific auditory needs, may actually help. And for kids with CVI, that is because um, kids with CVI may have difficulty regulating between auditory input and visual input. And when faced with visually taxing activities, may benefit from controlled auditory input. So headphones, noise canceling headphones, FM units to make a direct connection between the primary speaker and what the student's listening to. You can get FM units that are connected to headphones rather than to hearing aids, like in the picture. Sound walls and other environmental supports that can reduce the ambient noise and background chatter in the classroom. Even in a workstation, think about auditory support that reduces multisensory complexity. All right, so now let's get right into this assessment process and thinking about what we call biobehavioral state assessment. States refers to the condition of the person, so like the arousal level of the student. Where is that student currently at? From passed out to stressed out or freaking out. Biobehavioral refers to the biophysical, biological, and the behavioral or environmental influences on that child's state, the internal factors and the external factors, including the biophysical internal factors, which I think we often forget. Okay, this is biobehavioral, internal, external. Now, there's different ways of measuring that. The two most common ones are through the Carolina Record of Individual Behavior, and then through the work of Doug Guess and colleagues in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, what I realized is that nobody had really touched a lot of this work since like the 90s. And I think this was like a big approach that was used for kids with significant, severe and multiple disabilities, as they called it, in the 80s and 90s. And looking at this work, I realized that it was still super important to our students, and that it also had an application to kids with CVI specifically. But definitely to kids with multiple disabilities and sensory needs. So whichever one you pick, they're basically the same. They're pretty parallel. But what we're looking at is basically a scale from totally passed out to completely freaking out, stressed out, right? From deep sleep to uncontrollably agitated. And you have all these states in between. Deep sleep is like really passed out, dreaming, REM sleep. Intermediate sleep is not quite that deep sleep, not maybe dreaming, but definitely passed out. Active sleep is that state where you're kind of in between, and you might wake up, you might fall back asleep, you might not really know, am I dreaming or not? Maybe you hit the alarm or whatever. You're kind of in between. Drowsy is what we mentioned, kind of like nodding out. Quiet awake is where you're probably mostly at right now. If you're not drowsy or passed out, then you're like right here with me and attending. Kind of like it's a little bit more passive than that next state, which is active awake, sitting at the edge of your seat, ready to go, amped, totally focused, engaged, right? Which I don't expect anyone to be doing on a webinar, except for when I show the cat videos. Then there's fussy awake, where you're starting to get a little more, overstimulated. Maybe you're hungry, maybe you're thinking about something else, and you're like, all right, wrap it up, Chris. And then there's mildly agitated, right? A little more like kind of like really on the verge of not being with me at all. And then uncontrollably agitated, freaking out, temper tantrum, throwing the desk, and kicking and screaming. And I think we can all recognize, as we said before, that we are not learning when we're in deep sleep, and we're not learning when we're uncontrollably agitated. But in fact, from a neurological standpoint, we are not learning in anything but these two states. We are only learning and making that neurological progress and those connections in our brain when we are either quiet awake or active awake. So our goal is not to, come back later and postpone learning when a student is not in those states. Our goal is also not to wake up a student who is in deep sleep, or to tell a student, oh, just calm down and come sit down, take a little break when they're uncontrollably agitated. We know that's not going to work. So once they're on those total extremes, we're done for at least a little while, until they regenerate or until they calm down. But what we can do is we can influence a student who's drowsy, or we can influence a student who's fussy to come up a little bit or down a little bit and be in those preferred states. Preferred awake states, right, is what the guests and colleagues called that. So that is the goal of intervention. It's to identify when is a student in these states that are just outside of that, that preferred area, and what can we do? What kind of input can we give them, and how can we moderate the environment and the materials and the interactions in order to keep them in that preferred state for as long as possible throughout the day. So the purpose of assessment is to generate the information that we need to support that plan to increase their availability for learning by modifying internal and external factors, right? By modifying the environmental factors, as well as the materials themselves, the communication behaviors and practices that we use, the schedule and timing. And now think about the CVI schedule as being a perfect example of a tool to try to moderate availability for learning. We don't want to schedule 5 visually taxing activities on top of each other. I had a student who the speech pathologist wanted me to come in and help them do a biobehavioral assessment after hearing about some of this, because she said, I don't know what's going on. The student is always exhausted and doesn't attend when he is in the speech room. When and then, like, is it just me? Does he not like me, or am I doing something wrong? What is it? So I was like, come in all prepared to do a full-on assessment, and in the process, I asked the team, well, can I just get a schedule for the student so that I can plan my own day? And I'm glad I did that, because all I had to do was look at the schedule in order to recognize what the problem was. The problem was that the student just had ELA, math, PT, OT, and now we're going to have speech. And it's like the student just did visually taxing and physically taxing activities all morning. Now you want to go to speech, right? And it's a simple fix. Do not schedule speech at that time. And sometimes people will tell you, oh, but my schedule's so busy, I don't have a lot of flexibility here. Well, there's a difference between, rescheduling and allowing the student to actually focus on some of your goals and have some interactions that are meaningful, and continuing to do to just make do with that schedule. And the student will continue to be passed out all year in speech. So, priorities. Also, the biophysical management plan, right? We may not be able to impact does the child need to take this medication? But maybe we can address, obviously, with the family and with doctors, does the student have to take the medication at this time, if we know that it's causing unavailability for so long of the day? Okay. So there's a lot of work, like, in the 90s, like I said, to sort of start to assess these things. There was some good work out of TSBVI. Some of it had to do with assessing voluntary motor movement, looking at starting to assess biobehavioral states across like a 2-week period even, where we're going to take these states, and you see in the bottom right, those are the different behavioral states. And, at a certain time interval, a half-hour interval throughout the day, every single day, we're just going to mark what state is the child in. And what we're looking for is some kind of pattern, right? Some kind of trend. Well, the student tends to be passed out at 12 p.m. Not surprising, he just ate lunch and had a long morning. So yes, he's passed out. There may be something more subtle though. When is it that the student is fussy? When is it that they are active, right? What's happening at those times? And this is a nice assessment, but it's really only looking at the levels of arousal. It's not digging into the qualitative aspects, the internal and external factors. So any assessment needs to have some background information. So in biobehavioral assessment, we're going to gather some background information within 24 hours before we do an observation. Then we're going to do an observation. We're going to kind of like take some data on the states. And then we're going to look at that data and summarize it and turn it into an intervention. So here's some examples from the TSBVI website, from some of the stuff they did in the 90s. I think, and get the background information on food and liquid intake, seizure medication, seizure information, medication information, sleep information, all within 24 hours. And then we've got the observation itself, and we've got in this one we chose a 15-minute time interval. It could be any time interval that's relevant to the student. It shows those changes in states. And we've got the activity, we've got what state they're in, we've got what position they're in, what the other stimulus is, some ambient conditions, and some social conditions. If we look at this student, we see that they arrived to school quiet and awake, seated. It was cold and windy. They were greeted by the TA. They had breakfast. They were drowsy during breakfast. They were supine during breakfast. I don't know if that means maybe this is a student who was tube fed. Normal temperature, they're getting a little drowsy. Then they go to the bathroom for toothbrushing, and they are mildly agitated. They're seated. And there's hand over hand manipulation. And does anybody else get mildly agitated when somebody hand over hand toothbrushes them? So not surprising. And then there's hair drying, which is a quiet awake. We got agitated, but then we calmed back down because hair drying was nice and calm activity. The TA was talking to them. The bathroom wasn't as noisy now. And then the hair brushing, also a nice calming sensory activity. And now we got picked back up a little bit and ready to go, so that by the time we get to drama class, we're active, awake, and we're good. Okay. So that's kind of the idea, and we're looking at, well, what are these different factors? So I basically took a lot of that stuff, and then I tried to sort of like synthesize some other pieces that I thought were relevant to our students and create something that was holistic and comprehensive. So this is just the first page of it. It's like the coding key. So you've got the behavior states. We're looking at the environmental lighting, the sound level, the temperature in the room, the position that the student is in, the social context, the communication context. Okay. And then you've got this is just the little, like the instructions, review some background information. We've got some additional resources with some links to those things, some of the stuff we've talked about today. We're going to get the background, we're going to do an observation, and then we're going to summarize that and come up with recommendations. So here's the background information, food and liquid intake, similar to what they had in TSBVI. I added a couple things. To medication, I added comments on the description of the side effects of the medication. So I want to know, okay, he's on this medication, but it tends to make him drowsy, right? Or it tends to make him irritable. Sleep information, And then I also added elimination activity because I think that has a big impact on a student's availability and their internal, um, equilibrium. Seizure activity, as well as some comments, comments before and after, some kind of like aura and state stuff. And then here is the chart itself. So rather than, like that first one where we just coded the behaviors, now we're going to attribute the internal and external factors as well. So choose a time interval, it could be 15 minutes, a half hour. Write a little bit about the activity that's happening there. What's happening in that activity? And then you just go across here and circle what you're observing. What's the behavior state? What position is the student in? What's the environmental context, the lighting, temperature, sound level? The social context, like hand under hand, just proximity of somebody, physical proximity, physical contact, communication partner. And you're just kind of going down the line and getting a sense of, what's happening in all of these external and internal capacities when the student is in these activities throughout the day. Well, other thing I should mention is that all of the research on biobehavioral coding of those states, it shows that if you have a basic understanding of what those behavior states are, drowsy, alert, agitated, whatever, if you have a basic idea of what those terms mean, there is very good inter-observer reliability for scoring those. So anybody can score this pretty reliable. If they know what those states are, they know what they're looking for. So you could fill this out. You could do as many pages as you want of this. And then in an informal evaluation, you're just looking at, in each of these different behavior states, do they tend to happen during specific times of day, in specific positions, in specific environmental contexts, in specific social and communication contexts. And then the recommendations for intervention are changes to the biophysical management plan, changes to the student's schedule, changes to the positioning, environmental modifications. A lot of that is like our CVI go-to things, social contexts, communication partners, communication interaction supports, and then actual materials and instructional routines, which would also come out in in a CVI range assessment. This is just the same thing here. Okay, so let me just back up. We have like 10 minutes to go. There's a lot of stuff here on like interaction strategies, stuff like this. You guys have heard this a million times. So I wanted to get to a couple more maybe things that might be more interesting for you. Here's another little resource and tool to help plan positioning. I find this to be massively important for kids who have any level of physical adaptive need, any level of, physical adaptive need. So this is more like a conversation piece, a conversation tool for the team to get together and just talk about what the students' needs are. You could almost think of it like as a positioning schedule, as opposed to, you could even add this as a column onto the student's CVI schedule if you wanted to. But you're basically looking at the activity, what position you're recommending the student be in during that activity. For example, and I thought about this because I saw a student with CVI who was really having trouble attending to attending to a reading instruction, reading sight words, when he was in a stander, right? Of course, because being in a stander is very uncomfortable for that student. So, stretching out his legs and being in that stander, it was so physically overwhelming that the visual skills and the visual attending behaviors were significantly impacted and reduced. So, for the most visually taxing activities, maybe the student needs to be in the most physically comfortable positioning. For the least visually taxing activities, where we're focusing on auditory access, where we're maybe, not requiring as much visually, maybe then that student could be in the less comfortable physical positioning in order to work on those important, PT related goals. So what is the optimal position? What is any physical adaptive equipment that is needed in order to achieve that, including, low-tech things like pillows, tumble forms, armrests, and so on? What are some extra adaptations and equipment that is needed to support attending and availability, like a slant board, the presentation of materials in the right or the left or the center or upper? And then what are some physical assistance approaches that are need to be provided by the teacher, like hand under hand and so on? Okay, so I just wanted to spend this last just like another 5 minutes and then turn it over back to you guys in the last few minutes. uh, what about the real world, right? What about community outings? And the first thing I thought of was a totally overstimulated environment like a grocery store, visually overstimulating, and also multisensory overstimulating. There's complexity, there's novelty, there's light, there's movement, there's lots of other kind of things going on, right? Planning ahead and previewing can have a huge impact on availability during when you get to the busy place, right? That's the first thing. If you have a student who has some access to 2D information, take a video before you go to that place, especially if it's a place that you go to frequently. Have a video walking through the store that you can look at and pause, and you can talk about what you're seeing, and you can, use the markup on your iPad or whatever to, to circle. Oh yeah, let's look at that. There's a landmark. That's something we're going to find. I was on a call recently with families, and someone asked the question about, my child really has difficulty in the gym. Okay, and always gets overstimulated in the gym and wants to, kind of put their back against the wall and is stressed and overstimulated and doesn't want to participate. Well, some go-to things to do about that. One would be to preview the gym or get there before the activity, before the other kids show up and it gets so busy. Another would be to, find a base, find like a safe place in the gym, that is a place that we could always go to, and make that place easy to see, like a home base, like a base to escape to. Also, create landmarks in the gym. If they don't exist already, create them, so the student can orient themselves better, even when things are more chaotic. There may be some other ones you can think of too. Take a video, review what's going to happen in advance, and then model those things in real time. Right? Take the video with you. Take the pictures to match and pair the landmarks with you. So what you're doing is you're starting to build familiarity and build predictability within uncontrolled settings, within new places. I've even seen, like, you're going to go on a field trip or you're going to go take a trip somewhere specific. Get on Google Earth, or yeah, it's Google Earth that you can do that on, right? Or you can literally walk through the town and you can walk through that location. You can see what might it look like to take a walk through Central Park, right? If you're going to come and visit. And look at those things and talk about them, the things we're going to see, but actually, visually look at them. And then make sure that you go back and review what happened after the activity too. So yeah, I mean, there's like more here on planning ahead, previewing, modeling in real time. I mean, I think I've kind of talked about it already. And then, you can even create literacy routines that practice those things as well, right? What did we see and touch in that activity? Experience books are a way to do that, and there's just a ton more resources on this stuff, where we can start to. What we're doing is building predictability, familiarity, and visual connections in uncontrolled settings in the real world. And that's going to look different in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. You are more than welcome to have a copy of my PowerPoint. You're also more than welcome to reach out to me. I think I gave 2 different emails. You can contact me at either one of them. I'll put my other one in the chat box. There we go. So either one is good. Feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much again to Donna. Thanks, Jen and Sherry. And thank you to Jenny And thank you to Rebecca, and thank you so much to the interpreters. You're fantastic, and I appreciate you.